My name is Vincent Marchetti. I was the mayor of Riverside Falls when the zombie outbreak started 3 days ago. In 72 hours, I watched my town of 18,000 people turn into flesh-eating monsters. I lost my wife and daughter to the infection. I made impossible choices that saved 200 survivors but cost me everything I loved. This is how we survived the first 3 days of hell. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Vincent Marchetti, and I served as the mayor of Riverside Falls for 6 years before everything went to hell. I was 52 years old, third-term mayor of a town that had 18,000 residents who trusted me to keep them safe. I knew most of them by name. I had been to their weddings, their kids' graduations, their funerals. That was my job, and I was proud of it. Riverside Falls was a small industrial town in upstate New York, the kind of place where neighbors looked out for each other, and the biggest controversy was usually about snow plowing schedules or property taxes. I had a background in municipal engineering before I got into politics. Started as a city councilman 8 years before becoming mayor. My philosophy was simple. Know your community, be hands-on, and never make promises you cannot keep. I believed in walking the neighborhoods, showing up to town events, and making sure the infrastructure worked. Water, power, roads, emergency services. The basics that keep a community alive. I thought I understood what it meant to protect people. I was wrong. 3 days before the outbreak, we had been dealing with what seemed like routine water treatment issues. The plant had reported unusual bacterial readings in the main reservoir. Nothing too alarming, but enough that our water department recommended a boil water advisory as a precaution. I signed off on it myself. We sent out the notifications through our emergency alert system, posted signs around town, and figured we would have it sorted out within a week. Standard municipal crisis management. I had handled dozens of similar situations over the years. Looking back, that boil water advisory was too little, too late. Most of our residents had been drinking straight from the tap for weeks before we caught the problem. The bacterial readings should have been our first warning, but none of us understood what we were really dealing with. How could we? Nothing in my municipal engineering background had prepared me for what was growing in our water supply. Tuesday, October 15th, 2024, 2:30 in the afternoon. I called an emergency town council meeting to address the growing complaints about our water situation. Residents had been calling City Hall all morning, angry about the rusty taste, pressure drops, and strange chemical odors coming from their faucets. I had Councilman Peterson, our water department supervisor, and 3 other council members crammed into the conference room on the second floor of Town Hall. We were going over budget numbers, trying to figure out how much it would cost to bring in outside contractors to flush the entire system. Peterson was complaining about the water department's budget constraints when we heard the first scream. It cut right through his presentation about filtration costs and emergency repair funds. The sound came from outside, somewhere on Main Street below our windows. I looked up from the paperwork and saw Peterson's face go white. The other council members stopped talking mid-sentence. Through the conference room windows, I could see Main Street perfectly. It was a clear October afternoon, the kind of day when people like to walk downtown and visit the local shops. Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop was stumbling across the street, her gardening apron covered in something dark. She was moving wrong, jerky and unsteady, like she was hurt or sick. Behind her, I saw Tom Bradley. Tom had been our mailman for 15 years. He delivered to my house every morning at 8:30 sharp, always had a smile and a wave. Good man, never missed a day, even in the worst winter weather. But the thing following Mrs. Henderson was not the Tom Bradley I knew. His postal uniform was torn to pieces, hanging off him in bloody strips. His mouth was hanging open and his eyes looked empty, completely empty. Tom caught Mrs. Henderson right in front of Morty's deli. What happened next will stay with me until the day I die. He bit into her neck like an animal. The sound she made was not human. It was the sound of pure terror and agony. Blood sprayed across the deli's front window, and Mrs. Henderson collapsed to the sidewalk while Tom kept tearing at her throat. Peterson started swearing, asking what the hell was happening down there. I was already reaching for my radio, trying to stay calm and think like a mayor instead of panicking like everyone else in that room. Emergency response. That was my job. Get help, assess the situation, coordinate with the proper authorities. Dispatch, this is Mayor Marchetti. We need ambulances on Main Street immediately. Some kind of attack in progress. The words felt stupid coming out of my mouth. Attack? What was I supposed to call it? I had no framework for what I was seeing. No training, no protocol, no experience that made sense of Tom Bradley eating Mrs. Henderson alive in broad daylight. The dispatcher, Jenny Morrison, came back confused and asking for details. I tried to explain what we were witnessing, but even as I spoke, I could see more people stumbling out of the shops and buildings along Main Street. They were moving with that same jerky, unnatural gait. Something was very wrong with them. Their clothes were torn, many of them had blood on their faces and hands, and they were all converging on the area where Tom was still crouched over Mrs. Henderson's body. By 3:15, our phones would not stop ringing. City Hall's main lines, my personal cell phone, the emergency hotline, everything was lighting up with panicked calls from residents reporting similar attacks all over town. People were calling about their neighbors, their family members, their coworkers acting violently and attacking others. The calls were coming from every neighborhood, every district, every corner of Riverside Falls. By 3:30, the cell towers went dead. Just like that, no signal, no data, no communication with the outside world. Our landlines were still working, but the volume of incoming calls was overwhelming our small municipal phone system. Jenny at dispatch was trying to coordinate with county emergency services, but she was getting busy signals and disconnected calls. Something was happening beyond our town borders too. By 4 o'clock, I was barricaded in the town hall conference room with 12 other people, watching through the windows as our neighbors tore each other apart in the streets below. The scenes were getting worse by the minute. More people were stumbling out of buildings, but they were not looking for help or trying to escape. They were hunting. That was the only word for it. They moved with purpose, tracking down anyone who was still uninfected, still human. I tried calling my wife Maria 17 times before accepting that the networks were down. Maria taught 4th grade at Riverside Elementary School. She would have been there for after-school tutoring when this started. Our daughter Sophia taught 2nd grade at the same school. They would have been together, probably trying to protect the kids, probably using the school's tap water to make afternoon snacks for the children in their care. The thought of Sophia and Maria drinking that contaminated water, of it working through their systems over the past few days, made me physically sick. I kept trying to push the images out of my head, but I could not stop thinking about them. Were they safe? Were they trapped somewhere waiting for help? Or were they already like the things I was watching through the conference room windows? The water. It had to be the water. The timeline made perfect sense once I started putting the pieces together. 3 days earlier, we had detected the bacterial contamination. People who had been drinking straight from the tap for weeks before our advisory would have gotten the highest concentrations of whatever was in our system. The infection had an incubation period, maybe 2 to 3 days for full transformation, but the early symptoms must have been subtle. Headaches, nausea, fever, the kind of things people might mistake for a common cold or food poisoning. But why had some people turned faster than others? Tom Bradley was delivering mail this morning, seemingly normal, and by afternoon he was attacking people in the street. Mrs. Henderson had been watering her flowers outside the shop just yesterday. I had seen her myself when I drove past. The progression was not consistent, which meant there were variables we did not understand. Dosage, individual immune response, maybe other factors we had not identified yet. Looking down at Main Street, I started to notice patterns in how these infected people were moving. They were not wandering randomly or acting completely without purpose. They seemed to remember certain routes, certain locations. Tom Bradley was staying near the post office area where he had worked for years. The infected people who had emerged from the hardware store were lingering around that block. It was like they retained some muscle memory, some connection to their former routines and familiar places. That observation would prove more important than I realized at the time. Peterson and the other council members were arguing about what to do next. Some wanted to try reaching the state police or the National Guard. Others thought we should attempt to get to our cars and drive out of town. But I was looking at the street and counting the infected people I could see from our single vantage point. There were at least 30 visible from the conference room windows, and that was just a few blocks of downtown. If the contamination had spread through our entire water system, and if the incubation period was consistent, then we could be looking at thousands of infected residents across Riverside Falls. Thousands of people who had been our neighbors, our friends, our family members just hours before. I made the decision to stay put in Town Hall for the night. The building was solid brick construction, built in 1952 with good bones and secure entrances. We had emergency supplies in the basement, backup power, and communication equipment that might still reach outside agencies once the initial chaos settled down. More importantly, leaving the building meant going into the street with those things, and I was not ready to risk the lives of the 12 people counting on me to make smart decisions. But staying also meant accepting that I might not be able to reach Sophia and Maria. Every minute we remained barricaded in Town Hall was another minute they might be trapped somewhere, waiting for help that was not coming. The guilt was crushing, but the mayor and me knew that getting more people killed in a rescue attempt would not bring my family back. I had to think strategically, not emotionally. As the sun started to set, the situation outside got worse. The infected people were becoming more active, more aggressive. They were gathering in larger groups and moving through the streets in coordinated patterns. I watched them break into cars, smash windows, and pursue anyone who tried to run. The sounds carried up to our conference room, breaking glass, screaming, and underneath it all, a low moaning that seemed to come from dozens of throats at once. Jenny Morrison, our dispatcher, managed to get through to the county emergency management office around 6 o'clock. The news was not good. Similar outbreaks were being reported in at least 4 other towns within a 50-mile radius. All of them had municipal water systems that drew from the same regional watershed. All of them were experiencing complete communication breakdowns and total loss of local law enforcement response. This was not just a Riverside Falls problem. This was regional, possibly statewide. The scope was beyond anything our small-town emergency management protocols could handle. Around 7 o'clock that evening, we heard something that made my blood run cold. The infected people outside had stopped their random moaning and started making different sounds, more purposeful sounds. They were communicating with each other somehow, coordinating their movements with clicks and grunts that almost sounded like a primitive language. When one group found a potential victim, others would respond to their calls and converge on the location within minutes. They were learning, adapting, getting smarter. By 8 o'clock, we could see fires starting in different parts of town. Some were probably accidental, caused by the chaos and destruction. But others looked deliberate, like the infected people were using fire as a tool to flush out survivors from their hiding places. The orange glow was spreading across multiple neighborhoods, and we had no way to contact our volunteer fire department. For all I knew, our firefighters were either dead or infected like everyone else. I spent the night making lists of municipal resources that might be useful for survival, lists of secure locations where other survivors might have taken shelter, lists of infrastructure that could be compromised or exploited. My municipal engineering background was the only useful thing I had left, so I focused on what I knew: water systems, power grids, emergency services, building layouts, and transportation networks. The keys in my pocket suddenly felt heavier. As mayor, I had master keys to most of the public buildings in Riverside Falls. The school district, the library, the community center, the fire station, the police station, the water treatment plant. If we were going to survive this, those keys might be the difference between life and death. Access to secure locations, emergency supplies, and critical infrastructure could give us advantages that other survivors would not have. But first, we had to make it through the night. Around midnight, something started pounding on the front doors of Town Hall. Not random violence, but deliberate, rhythmic impacts, like someone was using a tool or weapon to try breaking through. I looked down from the conference room window and saw 6 infected people working together to attack our main entrance. One of them was holding a piece of metal pipe, striking the doors in a steady pattern while the others pushed and pulled at the frame. They had learned to use tools. They were working as a team, and they had specifically targeted the building where we were hiding. Peterson whispered that maybe they could smell us or hear us moving around upstairs. But I was watching their behavior more carefully, and I realized something that terrified me more than their violence or their hunger. One of the infected people attacking our doors was wearing a city maintenance uniform. He had worked in this building for years, knew its layout, understood its weak points. He was leading the others to the most vulnerable entrance, the one that would give them the easiest access to the upper floors where we were trapped. They were not just using tools and working together. They were retaining professional knowledge and skills from their former lives. The infection was not destroying their memories completely. It was twisting them, turning their human knowledge into hunting advantages. I knew then that we could not stay in Town Hall much longer. If infected city employees were out there, they would eventually figure out how to get inside. They knew about the service entrances, the basement access, the emergency exits, all the ways in and out of every public building in Riverside Falls. Our advantages were becoming our weaknesses, but leaving meant making a choice about Sophia and Maria. It meant accepting that I might never find them, never know what happened to them, never have the chance to save them or say goodbye. The mayor in me said we needed to focus on the survivors we could actually help. The husband and father in me said I could not abandon my family. As dawn approached on the second day, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I was going to lead a small team to Riverside Elementary School to look for Sophia and Maria. The school was only 8 blocks from Town Hall, and if there were any survivors there, they would need help getting to safety. It was a reasonable tactical decision that also served my personal desperation to find my family. I just had no idea what we were going to find when we got there. The decision to leave Town Hall was the hardest choice I had made in 6 years as mayor. I had 12 people looking to me for leadership, 12 lives that would be at risk if I made the wrong call. But I also had a wife and daughter somewhere out there in that nightmare, and every hour we waited was another hour they might be trapped, injured, or worse. The rational part of my brain said we should stay barricaded and wait for outside help. The human part of my brain said I would never forgive myself if I did not at least try to reach them. I convinced 3 volunteers to come with me to Riverside Elementary. Peterson volunteered immediately, which surprised me because he had been the most vocal about staying put. Jenny Morrison from Dispatch insisted on coming because she knew the school's layout from her kids who had attended there. The third volunteer was Frank DeLuca, who ran the hardware store and had a pickup truck parked behind Town Hall. Frank thought we might need his vehicle if we found survivors who could not walk back on their own. Before we left, I made sure to bring my municipal master keys. Those keys opened every public building in Riverside Falls, including the school district facilities. If we found survivors barricaded inside classrooms or offices, we would need access to get them out safely. If we encountered locked security doors or emergency exits, the keys could be the difference between escape and being trapped with those infected people. We left town hall at 6:30 in the morning, just as the sun was coming up. The infected people seemed less active during daylight hours, though we could still see them moving through the streets in small groups. They were not wandering aimlessly anymore. They had territories now, patrol routes, areas they defended from other infected groups. The mailman Tom Bradley was still near the post office, but now he had 4 other infected people with him, all wearing torn postal uniforms. They had claimed that entire block as their hunting ground. The route to Riverside Elementary took us through 3 residential neighborhoods that I knew like the back of my hand. I had walked these streets during campaign seasons, knocked on doors, attended block parties, helped resolve neighbor disputes. Now those same streets looked like a war zone. Cars were overturned or crashed into buildings. Front doors were broken open, windows smashed, lawns littered with personal belongings that people had dropped while fleeing. But the most disturbing thing was how the infected people were moving. They were not just attacking randomly or chasing anything that moved. They were using familiar routes, taking shortcuts through yards and alleys that only locals would know. A group of infected people wearing manufacturing uniforms were following the exact path that factory workers used to walk to the bus stop every morning. They remembered their routines even after the infection had destroyed their humanity. Frank whispered that maybe we could use that against them somehow. If they were predictable, if they stuck to familiar patterns, we might be able to avoid them by taking routes they would not expect. But I was thinking about the larger implications. If infected people retained their local knowledge and professional skills, then the ones who had worked in critical infrastructure jobs would be incredibly dangerous. Police officers who remembered tactical training, firefighters who knew building layouts, city maintenance workers who understood utility systems. We reached the school at 7:15 without encountering any direct confrontations, though we had to hide behind cars twice when groups of infected people passed nearby. Riverside Elementary was a single-story brick building constructed in the 1980s, designed to accommodate about 400 students from kindergarten through 5th grade. The main entrance faced the street, with a large parking lot for staff and visitors. The building had emergency exits on all sides and a playground area behind the school. From the street, the school looked abandoned. Most of the windows were dark, and we could not see any movement inside. But several cars were still in the staff parking lot, including Maria's blue Honda Civic and Sophia's red Toyota. They had been there when the outbreak started. That gave me hope that they might have barricaded themselves inside rather than trying to drive home through the chaos. The main entrance was locked, but my master key opened it immediately. The hallways inside were dark and eerily quiet. Emergency lighting was still functioning, powered by the school's backup battery system, but most of the overhead fluorescents were off. Our footsteps echoed despite our efforts to move quietly. The familiar smell of school cleaning supplies and cafeteria food was overpowered by something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. We found the first bodies in the main hallway near the administrative offices. 3 adults and 2 children, all showing signs of violent attack. The wounds were consistent with what we had seen outside: bite marks, torn flesh, massive blood loss. But these people had not turned into infected. They had been killed before the infection could take hold, which meant some of the staff and students had been trying to fight back when this started. Sophia's classroom was in the East Wing, room 12. We made our way through the corridors carefully, checking each room as we passed. Most of the classrooms were empty, but we found evidence of hasty evacuation: overturned desks, scattered papers, personal belongings left behind. In one room, we discovered a barricade made from desks and chairs stacked against the door. Someone had tried to create a safe room, but the barricade had been torn apart from the outside. When we reached room 12, my heart stopped. The door was standing open, and I could see signs of struggle inside. Desks were overturned, bulletin boards were torn down, and there were dark stains on the linoleum floor that could only be blood. But there was no body, no sign of what had happened to Sophia or the children who had been in her class that afternoon. Peterson found a note taped to the whiteboard, written in Sophia's handwriting. Gone to cafeteria with mom and remaining students, trying to get them out through kitchen exit. If anyone finds this, we went toward the fire station. October 15th, 3:30 p.m. The timestamp meant they had written the note about an hour after the outbreak started. Sophia and Maria had been alive and thinking clearly enough to organize an evacuation. They had been trying to save the children, get them to safety, lead them to the fire station where they knew there would be emergency supplies and communication equipment. It was exactly what I would have expected from both of them, putting the kids first even when their own lives were in danger. But that note had been written almost 15 hours ago. Anything could have happened in that time. We followed their route toward the cafeteria, and that was where we found the real horror. The school's lunch program used tap water for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. The kitchen staff had been preparing afternoon snacks when the outbreak began, using water that was heavily contaminated with whatever had caused this infection. The result was a concentration of infected people, unlike anything we had seen on the streets. The cafeteria was full of infected children and staff, 20 or 30 of them, ranging in age from 6 years old to adult. They had been trapped in that space for hours, with no way out and no food except each other. The ones who had turned first had attacked the ones who were still human, creating a cycle of violence and infection that had consumed everyone in the room. When we opened the cafeteria doors, they all turned toward us at once. The infected children moved differently than the adults, faster and more unpredictable, but they still showed that same retention of familiar behavior. They recognized the hallways, knew which doors led where, remembered how to operate simple mechanisms like door handles and light switches. We slammed the cafeteria doors shut and barricaded them with a supply cart, but I knew we only had minutes before they broke through. Frank was already running toward the emergency exit, shouting for us to get out of the building. Peterson was trying to radio back to town hall, warning the others about what we had found. But I was staring at those cafeteria doors, listening to the sounds of infected children throwing themselves against the barrier, and realizing that Sophia and Maria had walked into this exact situation 15 hours earlier. Jenny Morrison grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the exit. She was saying something about survivors in the principal's office, that she had heard voices coming from that direction when we first entered the building. We ran through the administrative wing, and she was right. There were people barricaded inside the principal's office, adult voices responding when we called out through the door. My keys opened the office, and we found 6 survivors, 3 teachers, 2 custodial staff, and the principal herself, Mrs. Rodriguez. They had been trapped there since the outbreak started, surviving on bottled water and snacks from the office mini-fridge. They told us about the initial chaos, how the infection had spread through the cafeteria first, then moved into the classrooms as infected staff members attacked students and other teachers. Mrs. Rodriguez confirmed that Sophia and Maria had been trying to evacuate the remaining children through the kitchen exit. She had seen them leading a group of about 12 kids toward the back of the building around 4 o'clock the previous afternoon. But then the cafeteria had filled with infected people, and she had lost visual contact. She did not know if they had made it out safely or if they had been trapped like everyone else. But she gave me something more valuable than information. She gave me hope. Maria and Sophia were experienced teachers who knew emergency protocols. They would have had a plan, multiple escape routes, ways to keep the children calm and organized even in chaos. If anyone could have gotten those kids to safety, it would have been them. We needed to get the office survivors out of the school immediately. The infected people in the cafeteria were getting more agitated, and we could hear them starting to spread into other parts of the building. Frank suggested using his pickup truck to create a mobile barrier, driving right up to the emergency exit so the survivors could get into the vehicle without being exposed to attack. But first, we had to get past the cafeteria. The main hallway was the most direct route to the exit, but it meant going right past those doors we had barricaded. The alternative was taking a longer route through the classroom wings, but that would expose us for more time and increase the chances of encountering other infected people who might be roaming the building. I made the call to go straight through. We moved as a group, keeping the weaker survivors in the middle while Frank and I took point positions. The barricade was holding, but barely. We could see infected faces pressed against the glass panels in the cafeteria doors, their hands clawing at the barriers we had constructed. Some of them were children who had been in Sophia's class just yesterday, kids I had seen at school events and community gatherings. We almost made it. We were maybe 20 feet from the emergency exit when the barricade finally gave way. The infected people poured out of the cafeteria like a flood, moving faster than we had expected. Frank started shooting with a pistol he had brought from his store, but there were too many of them and they were too close. Peterson was trying to help Mrs. Rodriguez, who had twisted her ankle and could not run at full speed. I used my keys to open the emergency exit, but the door had an alarm system that started blaring as soon as we pushed it open. The sound attracted every infected person in the building, and probably half the ones in the surrounding neighborhood. We had maybe 30 seconds to get everyone into Frank's truck before we would be completely overwhelmed. Jenny Morrison made a split-second decision that saved all our lives. She ran back toward the cafeteria, shouting and making noise to draw the infected people away from the exit. It worked. Most of them turned to chase her instead of following us outside. We got the office survivors into Frank's truck and drove away from the school, but we had to leave Jenny behind. We could hear her screaming from inside the building as we pulled out of the parking lot. The drive to the fire station took 12 minutes through back streets and residential areas, where we were less likely to encounter large groups of infected people. Frank knew alternate routes from his years of making deliveries around town, and his local knowledge was just as valuable as my municipal access keys. We were learning that survival in this new world depended on combining different types of expertise and resources. The fire station was a logical choice for our next base of operations. It had emergency supplies, medical equipment, backup power, radio communication systems, and multiple vehicle bays that could be secured against attack. The building was constructed like a fortress, with solid concrete walls and minimal windows. If Sophia and Maria had made it there with the children, it would have been one of the safest locations in Riverside Falls. But as we approached the station, I could see that something was wrong. The main doors were standing open, and there were no signs of human activity. No vehicles in the bays, no lights in the windows, no radio chatter from the communication systems. If survivors had been there, they were gone now. We parked behind the building and entered through the back door, which my master key opened without difficulty. The interior of the station showed signs of hasty evacuation, but not violence. Equipment was missing, lockers were emptied, and the emergency supply cabinets had been cleaned out. Someone had taken the time to gather resources and leave in an organized fashion rather than fleeing in panic. I found another note, this one posted on the main bulletin board in the common area. It was written in Maria's handwriting. "Vincent, if you find this, we made it out of the school with 8 children. Took supplies and went to higher ground east of town. Old mining camp past Miller Road. Fire station not safe, too close to infected areas downtown. Following emergency protocols you taught us. We will wait there as long as we can. Love you. October 15th, 8 p.m. 8 p.m. the previous night. Maria and Sophia had been alive and well enough to organize an evacuation from the fire station. They had taken the children to the abandoned mining camp, which was actually a smart tactical decision. The camp was isolated, defensible, and had natural water sources that would not be connected to the municipal system. It was exactly where I would have told them to go if I had been thinking strategically instead of emotionally. But the mining camp was 12 miles from town, and we had no idea what they might have encountered on the way there. 12 miles of open road, infected people, and unknown dangers. Even if they had made it safely, they would be running low on supplies by now and wondering why help had not arrived. Peterson was examining the radio equipment and found that it was still functional. The fire station's communication system was more powerful than anything we had at Town Hall, capable of reaching state and federal emergency agencies if anyone was still monitoring those channels. He started sending out distress calls, requesting assistance for survivor groups in the Riverside Falls area. The responses we received were not encouraging. Similar outbreaks were being reported across the entire northeastern United States. Municipal water systems in dozens of towns and cities had been compromised. State resources were completely overwhelmed, and federal assistance was focused on major population centers. Rural communities like ours were essentially on our own until the initial crisis stabilized. But we also received a transmission that changed everything. Another survivor group, broadcasting from the water treatment plant 20 miles north of Riverside Falls, reported that they had evidence of deliberate sabotage. Someone had intentionally contaminated multiple water systems with what appeared to be an engineered biological weapon. This was not a natural outbreak or an accidental contamination. This was an attack. Frank asked the obvious question: who would do something like this, and why? But I was thinking about the implications for our immediate survival. If this was an intentional attack, then whoever was responsible might still be active in the area. They might be monitoring our communications, tracking survivor groups, planning follow-up attacks to eliminate anyone who had managed to escape the initial infection. We needed to get to the mining camp and find Maria, Sophia, and the children they had rescued. But we also needed to be prepared for the possibility that we were dealing with more than just infected people. We might be facing organized enemies who had caused this outbreak and wanted to finish what they had started. The fire station had weapons, tactical gear, and vehicles that could help us make the journey safely. But it also had something more valuable: a detailed map of the regional water system, showing every treatment plant, pumping station, and distribution network in a 50-mile radius. If we were going to understand how this attack had been carried out, that map would be essential. I made the decision to establish the fire station as our temporary base while we prepared for the trip to the mining camp. We had 8 survivors now, counting the people we had rescued from the school. We had access to emergency supplies, communication equipment, and transportation. Most importantly, we had a specific destination where we might find more survivors, including my family. But first, we needed to secure the building and gather intelligence about what we were really facing. The radio transmissions from other survivor groups were painting a picture of coordinated attacks across multiple states. This was bigger than Riverside Falls, bigger than our regional watershed, bigger than anything our small-town emergency protocols were designed to handle. As afternoon turned to evening, we started receiving reports of organized groups of infected people conducting systematic searches of buildings and neighborhoods. They were not just hunting randomly anymore. They were clearing areas methodically, working together with a level of coordination that suggested someone or something was directing their actions. That was when I realized we might not be dealing with a simple biological weapon. The infected people were retaining too much of their intelligence, their memories, their professional skills. They were learning, adapting, and organizing in ways that went beyond typical infection behavior. Whatever had been put into our water supply was not just turning people into mindless monsters. It was turning them into something worse, something that could think, plan, and hunt with purpose. The sun was setting, and we needed to make a decision about whether to attempt the journey to the mining camp in darkness or wait until morning. Either choice carried significant risks, but staying at the fire station much longer was becoming increasingly dangerous. The infected people were getting more active as night approached, and our radio position was broadcasting our location to anyone who might be listening. I was studying the map, planning potential routes to the mining camp, when Peterson came running from the communication room with news that made my blood run cold. He had intercepted a transmission from a group claiming responsibility for the water system attacks. They were not foreign terrorists or domestic extremists. They were former municipal employees, people who had worked in water treatment facilities across the region and had been fired or laid off in recent budget cuts. They had turned their knowledge of infrastructure against the communities that had employed them. They had created this outbreak as revenge against the towns and cities that had eliminated their jobs. And according to their transmission, the biological agent they had used was designed to create infected people who would retain enough intelligence to serve as an army for the next phase of their plan. Phase 2 was scheduled to begin at midnight, and we had no idea what that meant. The transmission about Phase 2 changed everything. We were not just dealing with a biological outbreak anymore. We were facing a coordinated attack by people who understood our infrastructure better than we did. People who had planned this revenge for months or maybe years. Former municipal employees who knew exactly how to cripple a community and turn its own citizens into weapons against each other. I had been thinking like a mayor trying to manage a crisis, but now I needed to think like a military commander preparing for war. The fire station was not just a temporary shelter anymore. It was our forward operating base, and we had less than 6 hours to prepare for whatever Phase 2 would bring. The first priority was expanding our survivor group and gathering more intelligence about the enemy's capabilities. We had 8 people, but we needed more if we were going to mount any kind of effective resistance. More importantly, we needed people with specific skills, medical training, military experience, technical knowledge, and local connections that could help us identify other survivor groups. Peterson suggested using the fire station's radio system to coordinate with other survivors in the area. We had been monitoring emergency frequencies all evening, picking up scattered transmissions from people trapped in various locations around Riverside Falls. A group of families was barricaded in the community center. Several individuals were hiding in the library basement. At least 12 people had taken shelter in the old factory building on the east side of town. But reaching those survivors meant venturing back into areas controlled by infected people, and we had seen how organized and intelligent those infected people were becoming. They were not just wandering around anymore. They were patrolling specific routes, guarding key locations, and responding to threats in coordinated formations. Getting to the community center would require crossing 3 blocks of downtown area where we had observed the largest concentrations of infected activity. Frank volunteered to lead a rescue mission to the community center while I organized our defenses at the fire station. His hardware store experience had taught him about building security, locks, barriers, and improvised weapons. He knew which buildings in town had the best sight lines and defensive positions. Most importantly, he had a pickup truck that could serve as mobile cover for moving survivors between locations. But I was reluctant to split our group when we did not fully understand what we were facing. The intercepted transmission had mentioned former municipal employees, but it had not specified how many people were involved in the conspiracy or what resources they had access to. Were we dealing with a few disgruntled workers, or was this a larger organization with sophisticated planning and equipment? The answer came at 9:30 that evening, when we received a direct radio transmission addressed specifically to me. The voice was familiar, though it took me several seconds to place it. Jake Morrison, who had worked at the water treatment plant for 12 years before being laid off in budget cuts 8 months earlier. Jake Morrison, whose wife Jenny was our dispatcher and had been killed at the elementary school trying to save the rest of us. Jake was broadcasting from the water treatment facility, and he knew exactly who was listening. He knew I was at the fire station. He knew about the survivors we had rescued from the school. He knew about Maria and Sophia's escape to the mining camp. He had been monitoring our communications since we left town hall, tracking our movements, studying our tactics and capabilities. The biological agent they had introduced into the water system was more sophisticated than we had realized. It was designed to preserve cognitive function while eliminating empathy, social bonds, and self-preservation instincts. The infected people retained their memories, skills, and intelligence, but they were completely loyal to whoever controlled the transmission frequency that could direct their behavior. Jake and his conspirators had turned our neighbors into a remote-controlled army. Phase 2 involved activating sleeper agents who had been consuming lower doses of the contaminated water over several weeks. These people appeared completely normal, showed no symptoms of infection, and had been moving freely among survivor groups throughout the region. But at midnight, they would receive an activation signal that would complete their transformation and turn them into infiltrators within our own communities. The implications were terrifying. Anyone we rescued could be a sleeper agent. Anyone we trusted could turn against us at midnight. Anyone who had been drinking tap water in recent weeks could be a time bomb waiting to explode in our midst. I looked at the 7 other survivors in the fire station and realized I had no way to know if any of them were compromised. Peterson had been drinking city water at his house every morning. Frank had used tap water at his hardware store for coffee and cleaning. Mrs. Rodriguez and the other school survivors had been exposed to the contaminated supply for weeks before the outbreak. Even I had consumed some tap water in the days before the boil advisory. Jake's transmission continued with specific details about Phase 2. The activated sleeper agents would not just turn violent. They would retain enough of their personalities and memories to maintain deep cover while sabotaging survivor groups from within. They would disable communications, contaminate food supplies, reveal defensive positions to infected attack forces, and eliminate key leaders when the time was right. The only way to identify sleeper agents was through a blood test that could detect trace amounts of the biological weapon. But we did not have testing equipment at the fire station. We would have to assume that everyone was potentially compromised and plan our defenses accordingly. Trust number 1 completely, verify all information independently, and maintain multiple backup plans for every critical operation. But Jake was not finished. He revealed that the mining camp where Maria and Sophia had taken the children was a trap. The abandoned facility had been chosen specifically because it was isolated and defensible, exactly the kind of location that survivors would naturally select for a long-term hideout. Jake's people had been monitoring the camp since yesterday evening, waiting for more survivor groups to gather there before springing their attack. My wife and daughter were walking into an ambush, and there was nothing I could do to warn them. The mining camp was 12 miles away through territory controlled by infected forces. Even if we could reach them in time, we would be playing directly into the enemy's hands by concentrating our survivors in a location they had prepared as a killing ground. The smart tactical decision was to abandon any rescue attempt and focus on establishing a more secure base of operations elsewhere. But the human decision, the husband and father decision, was to risk everything for the chance to save my family. Jake Morrison knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to force me into making emotional choices instead of strategic ones. That was when I realized this whole situation had been designed as a psychological weapon targeting me specifically. Jake blamed me personally for his termination from the water department. I had signed off on the budget cuts that eliminated his position. I had made the decision to prioritize other municipal services over water system redundancy. From his perspective, I had destroyed his career and his family's financial security. This entire outbreak was Jake Morrison's revenge against me, using the people of Riverside Falls as collateral damage in his personal vendetta. He wanted me to suffer the same loss and helplessness that he had experienced when he lost his job. He wanted me to watch my community destroyed, my family threatened, my leadership proven inadequate for the crisis he had created. But Jake had made one critical mistake. He had told me too much about his plans, revealed too many details about his capabilities and timeline. Now I knew that the mining camp was a trap, that sleeper agents would activate at midnight, and that the infected people could be controlled through radio transmissions. That knowledge gave me options I would not have had otherwise. The fire station's communication equipment included emergency broadcasting capabilities that could override local radio frequencies. If Jake was using radio signals to control the infected people, then we might be able to disrupt those signals, or even send conflicting commands that would turn his army against itself. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting passively and waiting for midnight. Peterson and Frank started working on the radio jamming plan while I studied the maps and tried to figure out how to reach the mining camp without walking into Jake's trap. The direct route along Miller Road was obviously compromised, but there were old logging trails and service roads that might provide alternative access. My municipal engineering background included knowledge of utility easements and maintenance routes that most people did not know existed. The challenge was time. We had less than 3 hours before the sleeper agent activation, and any rescue mission to the mining camp would take at least 4 hours round trip. Even if we could disrupt Jake's radio control system, we would still be dealing with hundreds of infected people who retained their intelligence and combat capabilities. But then Mrs. Rodriguez provided information that changed our tactical situation completely. The school district's emergency protocols included provisions for off-site evacuation centers in case of natural disasters or other large-scale emergencies. The mining camp was not just a random hideout that Maria and Sophia had chosen. It was an official evacuation site that all teachers and staff had been trained to use. That meant the camp had pre-positioned emergency supplies, communication equipment, and defensive preparations that would make it much more defensible than Jake Morrison realized. It also meant that Maria and Sophia would not be trapped there passively waiting for rescue. They would be organizing the children and other survivors, establishing perimeters, and preparing for exactly the kind of attack that Jake was planning. More importantly, the school district's evacuation protocols included a backup communication system that operated on different frequencies than the municipal emergency networks. If that system was still functional, we might be able to establish contact with the mining camp and coordinate our response to Jake's Phase 2 attack. I made the decision to attempt contact with the mining camp before committing to any rescue mission. If Maria and Sophia were alive and organizing defenses, they needed to know about the sleeper agent threat and the midnight activation timeline. If they were already dead or captured, then a rescue mission would be suicide for our entire group. The backup communication system worked. At 10:15, I heard Sophia's voice coming through the emergency radio, calm and professional despite the circumstances. She and Maria were alive and well, along with 6 of the 8 children they had evacuated from the school. They had also been joined by 14 other survivors who had made it to the mining camp independently, including 2 off-duty police officers and a paramedic. Sophia confirmed that they had established defensive positions around the camp and were monitoring the access roads for hostile activity. They had observed vehicles moving in the area after dark, but no direct attacks yet. Most importantly, they had tested all the survivors for potential infection using a basic blood chemistry kit from the camp's medical supplies. Everyone at the mining camp was clean, but Sophia also reported something that made my blood run cold. One of the children they had rescued from the school, a 10-year-old named Marcus Chen, had been showing unusual behavior since yesterday evening. He was asking detailed questions about the camp's defenses, trying to access the communication equipment, and volunteering for sentry duty despite being the youngest person in the group. His parents had been drinking tap water heavily in the weeks before the outbreak. Marcus was almost certainly a sleeper agent, programmed to activate at midnight and sabotage the mining camp's defenses from within. But he was also just a child, infected against his will and turned into a weapon by people who had no regard for innocent lives. The decision about how to handle the situation fell to me as the senior leader, and it was the kind of choice that would haunt me regardless of what I decided. I told Sophia to isolate Marcus immediately but quietly, without alerting him or the other children to what was happening. Create a plausible reason to separate him from the group, maybe claiming that he was needed for a special assignment or that he was showing signs of illness. Keep him under constant supervision until after midnight, when we would know for certain whether the activation signal would affect him. The clock was showing 11 o'clock, which gave us 1 hour to prepare for whatever Phase 2 would bring. Our radio jamming equipment was ready, our defenses were established, and we had communication with the mining camp. But we still had no idea how many sleeper agents were active in our area or what their specific instructions would be. That was when Frank made a suggestion that changed our entire strategy. Instead of trying to defend against Jake Morrison's attack, why not take the fight directly to him? The water treatment plant was the source of the contamination and the control center for the infected army. If we could capture or destroy the facility, we would eliminate Jake's ability to coordinate Phase 2 and potentially reverse the infection process for people who had not yet fully transformed. It was an incredibly risky plan that would require splitting our forces and attacking a heavily defended position with limited resources. But it was also the only way to end this crisis decisively instead of just surviving it. Defensive tactics would only delay the inevitable. Jake Morrison had resources, manpower, and strategic advantages that we could not match in a prolonged conflict. The water treatment plant was 8 miles north of the fire station, connected by a service road that I knew from my municipal engineering days. The facility was surrounded by a security fence, but my master keys included access to the utility gates and maintenance buildings. More importantly, I knew the plant's layout, operational procedures, and vulnerable points from years of budget meetings and inspection reports. Peterson volunteered to stay at the fire station with 3 other survivors to maintain communication with the mining camp and coordinate our radio jamming efforts. Frank, Mrs. Rodriguez, and I would take his pickup truck to the treatment plant and attempt to neutralize Jake Morrison before the midnight activation deadline. It was 11:30 when we left the fire station, driving through back roads and utility easements to avoid the main infected patrol routes. The treatment plant was located in a rural area outside town, which meant fewer infected people, but also less cover for our approach. We would have to cross open ground for the final half-mile, making us vulnerable to observation and attack. As we got closer to the facility, we could see lights in the main building and vehicles in the parking area. Jake Morrison was not alone. He had at least 6 other people working with him, probably other former municipal employees who had been recruited into his revenge conspiracy. The facility's security lights were all functioning, which meant they had full power and operational capability. But they had also made a critical mistake. The security lights eliminated their night vision and created blind spots around the perimeter where we could approach without being detected. My knowledge of the plant's layout included information about emergency access points that would not be covered by their defensive positions. We parked the truck a quarter-mile away and proceeded on foot through the utility easement that connected to the plant's rear entrance. My master key opened the maintenance gate without any problems, and we were inside the facility perimeter by 11:50. 10 minutes to midnight, 10 minutes before Jake Morrison's sleeper agents would activate and begin their coordinated attacks on survivor groups across the region. The main control room was located in the center of the building, surrounded by treatment tanks and chemical storage areas. We could hear voices and radio chatter coming from that direction, confirming that Jake and his people were monitoring the activation countdown and preparing to coordinate Phase 2. They were so focused on their radio communications that they had not posted adequate security around the building. We reached the control room at 11:58, just as Jake Morrison was beginning the activation sequence for the sleeper agents. I could see him through the window, sitting at a radio console surrounded by monitoring equipment and transmission devices. He was counting down the final seconds, preparing to send the signal that would turn innocent people into weapons against their own communities. I used my master key one last time, opening the control room door at exactly midnight. Jake Morrison turned around to see me standing in the doorway, and the expression on his face was a mixture of surprise, rage, and something that might have been relief. He had been waiting for this confrontation, planning for it, building his entire revenge strategy around the moment when he could face me directly and make me pay for destroying his life. But he had not planned for Mrs. Rodriguez, who moved faster than any of us expected and reached the radio console before Jake could complete the activation sequence. She shut down the transmission system with 5 seconds to spare, preventing the sleeper agent activation and saving every survivor group in the region. Jake Morrison's revolution was over before it had really begun, but the infected people he had already created were still out there, still dangerous, still hunting for survivors. The immediate crisis was ended, but the long-term challenge of rebuilding our community and healing from this attack was just beginning, and I still had to get back to the mining camp and reunite with my family. Jake Morrison's capture at the water treatment plant did not end our problems. It solved the immediate crisis of the sleeper agent activation, but we still had hundreds of infected people roaming Riverside Falls with retained intelligence and combat capabilities. Without Jake's radio control system, they were no longer coordinated, but they were still deadly and still hunting for survivors. The infection itself remained active in their systems, and we had no way to reverse the biological weapon's effects. Mrs. Rodriguez had prevented the midnight activation, but Jake revealed something during our interrogation that changed everything we thought we understood about the outbreak. The biological weapon was not permanent. It had a limited lifespan in the human body, approximately 72 hours from initial exposure to complete breakdown. The infected people we were fighting would begin returning to normal within the next 24 hours, assuming they survived that long and did not suffer fatal injuries during their infected state. But Jake had also prepared for the possibility that his radio control system might be compromised. He had programmed the infected people with basic survival instructions that would keep them active and dangerous even without direct commands. They would continue to hunt in groups, secure territory, and attack survivors until the biological weapon degraded naturally. We still had one more day of fighting ahead of us before this nightmare would end. The revelation about the 72-hour timeline also explained why some people had turned faster than others during the initial outbreak. Tom Bradley, the mailman, and Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop had been among the first to consume heavily contaminated water 3 days earlier. The children and staff at the elementary school had been exposed through the lunch program on the same timeline. People who had been drinking tap water more sporadically or in smaller quantities were still transforming when we captured Jake. This information was crucial for our survival strategy. We needed to protect the remaining uninfected people for approximately 18 more hours, while the biological weapon ran its course through the infected population. After that, we would be dealing with traumatized and confused former neighbors who would need medical attention and psychological support, but they would no longer be actively hunting us. The challenge was getting that information to Sophia and the other survivors at the mining camp. Jake's sabotage of the municipal communication systems had damaged more than just radio equipment. He had also planted explosive devices at key utility junctions that would cripple power and water distribution across the region. Even with the immediate threat neutralized, we were facing weeks or months without basic infrastructure while repair crews worked to restore essential services. Frank suggested using the water treatment plant's emergency broadcasting system to contact all survivor groups in the area simultaneously. The facility had backup power and high-powered transmission equipment that could reach a 50-mile radius. We could coordinate a regional response, share critical information about the 72-hour timeline, and organize rescue operations for isolated survivors who might not last another 18 hours on their own. But using the broadcasting system would also reveal our location to any remaining hostile forces in Jake's organization. We had captured Jake Morrison and 6 of his conspirators at the treatment plant, but the intercepted radio transmissions suggested a larger network of former municipal employees across multiple counties. Broadcasting our position could bring reinforcements or revenge attacks that we were not prepared to handle. I made the decision to risk the broadcast. The information about the biological weapon's limited duration was too important to keep secret. Every survivor group in the region needed to know that they only had to hold out for 18 more hours. Every person who was still hiding and running needed to understand that help was coming, and that this crisis would end naturally if they could just stay alive a little longer. The regional broadcast went out at 12:30 in the morning, reaching survivor groups from 3 different counties. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Emergency radio frequencies that had been silent for hours suddenly came alive with transmissions from people who had been afraid to reveal their positions. Police stations, fire departments, hospitals, schools, and private residences all reported in with survivor counts and status updates. The scope of the outbreak was larger than we had realized, but so was the survivor population. Jake Morrison's biological weapon had infected thousands of people, but tens of thousands more had either avoided contamination entirely or had consumed doses too small to cause full transformation. The infrastructure damage was severe but repairable. Most importantly, organized resistance was emerging in every affected community as local leaders realized they were not facing an indefinite siege. However, the broadcast also confirmed our worst fears about Jake's network. Similar attacks had been carried out simultaneously in 12 different municipal water systems across New York and Pennsylvania. The conspiracy involved at least 40 former water department employees who had been secretly coordinating their revenge for months. Jake Morrison was just one cell in a larger organization that had declared war on local government across the entire northeastern United States. The good news was that most of the other cells had been less successful than Jake's group. Several had been stopped before they could introduce the biological weapon into their water systems. Others had been detected early and contained before widespread infection could occur. Jake's attack on Riverside Falls was actually one of the worst-case scenarios, which meant our response and survival strategies could serve as a model for other affected communities. But we also received intelligence that made our immediate situation more dangerous. Jake's network had backup plans for exactly this scenario. If their primary attacks were neutralized and their control systems were compromised, they would resort to direct assault on survivor communities using conventional weapons and improvised explosives. Phase 3 would begin at dawn, targeting the largest concentrations of survivors in each affected area. The mining camp where Maria and Sophia were located had been identified as a high-priority target for Phase 3. Its isolated location and defensive advantages made it an ideal fortress for survivor resistance, which meant Jake's people would want to eliminate it before organized opposition could spread to other communities. They had spent the entire night moving personnel and equipment into position for a coordinated attack at first light. I had to get back to the mining camp immediately, but leaving the water treatment plant undefended would allow Jake's network to regain control of the facility and resume their biological weapon production. The plant contained enough chemical precursors to create massive quantities of the infection agent, and it had the distribution capacity to contaminate water systems across half the state. We could not abandon such a critical strategic asset. Frank volunteered to stay at the treatment plant with two other survivors to maintain control of the facility and continue radio coordination with other survivor groups. Mrs. Rodriguez insisted on coming with me to the mining camp because she had medical training that might be needed for treating injured children. That left us with a four-person team for what could be a complex rescue operation against heavily armed enemies. The journey back to the mining camp took us through territory that had changed dramatically since our trip to the treatment plant. The infected people were no longer following predictable patrol routes or maintaining territorial boundaries. Without Jake's radio control system, they were reverting to more basic hunting behaviors, moving in smaller groups and reacting more aggressively to unexpected encounters. In some ways, this made them more dangerous because their actions were no longer predictable. We took a route through the old logging trails that connected to the mining camp from the north. This approach would bring us in behind the camp's defensive perimeter and allow us to assess the tactical situation before making contact with Sophia and the other survivors. If Jake's people were already in position for their dawn attack, we needed to understand their capabilities and deployment before attempting any rescue operation. The mining camp was located in a natural bowl surrounded by forested hills, with a single main access road and several hiking trails leading to the facility. The abandoned mining operation had left behind a complex of industrial buildings, equipment storage areas, and administrative offices that provided excellent defensive positions. There were also underground tunnels connecting different parts of the facility, though I was not sure whether Sophia and the survivors knew about those access points. As we approached the camp through the forest trails, we could see lights and movement in the main buildings. Sophia and her group were awake and active, which suggested they were already aware of the threat and preparing their defenses. But we could also see vehicle headlights moving along the access road and what appeared to be armed figures taking positions in the surrounding hills. Jake's Phase 3 assault team was larger and better equipped than we had expected. I used the emergency radio to contact Sophia and warn her about the impending attack. She confirmed that they had observed hostile forces moving into the area around 3 o'clock in the morning and had been preparing for siege conditions since then. The off-duty police officers in their group had identified at least 12 attackers with military-style weapons and equipment. More concerning, some of the attackers appeared to be infected people who were following coordinated tactical orders, despite the breakdown of Jake's radio control system. That revelation changed our understanding of the biological weapon's effects. While most infected people had reverted to basic hunting behavior after the control system was shut down, some individuals were retaining higher cognitive functions and the ability to follow complex instructions. These enhanced infected could serve as squad leaders or specialists within Jake's assault teams. Combining human intelligence with the infected populations enhanced physical capabilities and reduced pain sensitivity. Sophia reported that they had established defensive positions in the mining camp's main administrative building and the equipment maintenance facility. They had stockpiled food, water, medical supplies, and ammunition from the emergency cache that had been prepositioned there as part of the school district's evacuation protocols. The children were secured in the underground areas of the administrative building, which provided the best protection from small arms fire and explosives. But the camp's defensive advantages also created tactical limitations. There were only two ways out of the facility: the main access road and a hiking trail that led to an emergency helicopter landing zone 2 miles away. Both routes were probably covered by Jake's assault team, which meant any evacuation attempt would require fighting through prepared positions with superior firepower. The survivors could hold their current position for several hours, but they could not break out without outside assistance. Mrs. Rodriguez suggested using the underground tunnel system to infiltrate the camp and establish a second defensive position that could provide covering fire for an evacuation attempt. My municipal engineering background included some knowledge of mining operations from the regulatory oversight we provided to abandoned facilities. Most mining camps had tunnel networks that connected to natural cave systems or emergency escape routes that might not be obvious to attackers who were not familiar with the local geography. We spent an hour scouting the perimeter and locating the tunnel entrances that I remembered from municipal inspection reports. The main tunnel system was partially collapsed, but there were secondary passages that led directly under the administrative building where Sophia's group was located. More importantly, one tunnel connected to a natural cave that opened on the far side of the ridge, well beyond the area that Jake's assault team had surrounded. The plan was to use the tunnel system to reach Sophia's group and coordinate a fighting withdrawal to the cave exit. The children and non-combatants would evacuate through the tunnels, while the adults provided defensive fire to keep the attackers focused on the main buildings. Once everyone was safely out of the immediate area, we could use the radio to call for backup from other survivor groups or law enforcement agencies that might be responding to the regional emergency. But first, we had to reach the tunnel entrance without being detected by the assault team. The access point was located in a maintenance shed about 200 yards from the main buildings, across open ground that was covered by multiple observation positions. We would need a distraction to draw attention away from our infiltration route. That distraction came at 4:30 in the morning, when the infected people in the area began their own assault on Jake's positions. Without radio control to coordinate their actions, the infected were reverting to territorial behavior and treating the armed assault team as invaders in their hunting ground. The result was a three-way battle between infected people, Jake's team, and Sophia's defenders that created chaos and confusion across the entire mining camp area. We used the confusion to reach the tunnel entrance and make our way underground toward the administrative building. The tunnels were in better condition than expected, with emergency lighting systems that were still functional and structural supports that had been maintained as part of the facility's emergency preparedness protocols. The school district had done excellent work in preparing this evacuation site. Sophia was waiting for us when we emerged from the tunnel entrance in the building's basement. She had been monitoring our radio communications and had prepared the children for immediate evacuation through the underground route. The sight of my daughter, alive and competent and leading other people to safety, was the first moment of pure relief I had experienced since this nightmare began. But Sophia also had disturbing news about Marcus Chen, the 10-year-old boy we suspected of being a sleeper agent. When the midnight activation deadline had passed without triggering his transformation, we had assumed he was not infected. But around 2 o'clock in the morning, he had begun showing signs of delayed activation. Unlike the other infected people, Marcus was retaining his personality and emotional connections while gaining the enhanced physical capabilities and reduced pain sensitivity of the biological weapon. Marcus was becoming something new, something that Jake Morrison's people had not anticipated when they designed their biological weapon. He was infected but not hostile, enhanced but still human, capable of bridging the gap between the survivor population and the infected people who would be returning to normal within the next 12 hours. He could be the key to understanding how to help other infected people make the transition back to their normal lives. But Marcus was also terrified, confused, and struggling with physical changes that he did not understand. He needed immediate medical attention and psychological support, but we were trapped in an active combat zone with limited resources and no access to proper medical facilities. Sophia had been doing her best to keep him calm and stable, but his condition was deteriorating as the biological weapon continued to affect his system. The evacuation through the tunnel system took 45 minutes, moving 14 adults and 6 children through narrow passages while maintaining radio contact with our defensive positions above ground. The infected people and Jake's assault team were still fighting each other around the main buildings, which provided cover for our withdrawal, but also created unpredictable dangers as the battle moved through different areas of the mining camp. We emerged from the cave exit just as the sun was rising, providing our first clear view of the tactical situation. Jake's assault team was larger than we had initially estimated, with at least 20 people armed with military-style weapons and supported by several vehicles. But they were also taking heavy casualties from their battle with the infected people, who were fighting with suicidal intensity and seemed immune to suppression fire. The enhanced infected individuals who had retained tactical intelligence were coordinating the infected assault in ways that Jake's people had not expected. They were using cover effectively, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated attacks that suggested military training from their pre-infection lives. Some of them might have been former soldiers or police officers whose professional skills had been preserved and enhanced by the biological weapon. From our position on the ridge above the mining camp, we could see the larger pattern of the battle. The infected people were not just attacking randomly. They were systematically eliminating Jake's assault team and securing the facility for their own use. In a few hours, when the biological weapon degraded and they returned to normal, they would be in control of a strategic location with significant supplies and defensive advantages. That realization changed our entire perspective on the situation. Instead of fighting to escape from the mining camp, we should be working to help the infected people secure it and preparing for their eventual return to normal. They would need medical attention, psychological support, and leadership to help them understand what had happened and how to rebuild their lives. We could be that leadership if we stayed and helped instead of running away. I made the decision to return to the mining camp and attempt communication with the enhanced infected individuals who were leading the assault. If they retained enough intelligence to coordinate military tactics, they might be capable of understanding that the biological weapon was temporary and that cooperation with survivors was in everyone's best interest. It was the most dangerous decision I had made since this crisis began, but it was also our best chance to end the violence and start the healing process that our community would need to survive this attack and rebuild stronger than before. The future of Riverside Falls was about to be decided in the next few hours, and everything would depend on whether we could bridge the gap between the infected and the survivors before the biological weapon completed its 72-hour cycle. The decision to approach the enhanced infected people leading the assault on Jake's team was either the smartest tactical move I had ever made or the last mistake I would ever make. But watching them coordinate their attack with military precision, I realized these were not mindless monsters anymore. They were our neighbors, our friends, our community members who had retained their intelligence and skills despite the biological weapon coursing through their systems. Sophia insisted on coming with me for the approach, arguing that her experience with Marcus Chen had taught her how to communicate with infected people who were transitioning between states. Mrs. Rodriguez would stay with the children and other survivors at the cave exit, maintaining radio contact and prepared to coordinate evacuation if our negotiation attempt failed catastrophically. The enhanced infected individual leading the assault appeared to be Officer David Park, one of the off-duty police officers who had been reported missing since the outbreak began. He was directing a squad of 6 other infected people in a flanking maneuver against Jake's remaining positions, using hand signals and tactical formations that demonstrated retained professional training. Most importantly, he was showing concern for the safety of his infected squad members, which suggested that emotional connections and protective instincts had survived the biological weapon's effects. I approached Officer Park's position with my hands visible and my radio broadcasting on emergency frequencies so that other survivor groups in the region could monitor our conversation. If this negotiation succeeded, the techniques we developed could be used to establish communication with infected people in other affected communities. If it failed, At least other survivors would understand what had gone wrong and avoid making the same mistakes. Officer Park recognized me immediately, though his response was unlike anything I had experienced during my years as mayor. His voice was hoarse and strained, but his words were coherent and focused. He knew who I was, remembered our previous interactions, and understood the current tactical situation better than most uninfected people would have. The biological weapon had enhanced his cognitive processing while preserving his core personality and memories. The conversation that followed changed everything I thought I understood about leadership, community, and human nature. Officer Park explained that the enhanced infected people were not following Jake Morrison's programming anymore. They had developed their own objectives, based on protecting their infected community members and securing resources for the transition period when the biological weapon would degrade and leave them vulnerable. They had been monitoring our radio communications and understood that the 72-hour timeline meant they would return to normal by afternoon. But they also knew that Jake's organization would not stop with this single attack. The biological weapon was designed to be reproducible, and the network of former municipal employees had the knowledge and resources to launch similar attacks in other communities until their demands for revenge were satisfied. Officer Park's enhanced infected squad had captured detailed intelligence about Jake's network during their assault on the mining camp. They had interrogated captured members of the assault team and discovered that Phase 3 involved more than just direct attacks on survivor communities. Jake's people were planning to contaminate food distribution centers, pharmaceutical supplies, and emergency medical stockpiles across the entire region. The goal was to create a sustained crisis that would overwhelm government response capabilities and force federal authorities to negotiate with the conspiracy. Jake Morrison and his network wanted full pardons for their attacks, financial compensation for their lost employment, and guaranteed positions in the emergency management agencies that would be created to handle the ongoing crisis. This revelation meant that stopping Jake's immediate assault team would not end the threat to our community. We were dealing with a long-term insurgency that would continue launching attacks until their political demands were met or until their entire network was eliminated. The infected people who were fighting Jake's forces were not just protecting themselves. They were protecting every uninfected person in the region from months or years of continued biological warfare. Officer Park proposed an alliance between the enhanced infected people and the survivor communities. The infected individuals had physical capabilities and tactical advantages that could be decisive in hunting down Jake's network before they could launch their next wave of attacks. The survivors had organizational skills, communication resources, and political connections that could coordinate a regional response to the insurgency. But the alliance would require trust between groups that had been trying to kill each other for the past 3 days. The survivors would have to accept that infected people could be allies rather than enemies. The infected people would have to control their enhanced aggression and work cooperatively with people they had been programmed to hunt. Both sides would have to overcome psychological barriers that went against every survival instinct they had developed during the crisis. Sophia supported the alliance proposal, pointing to her experience with Marcus Chen as evidence that infected people could retain their humanity and work toward common goals. Marcus had been struggling with the transition, but he had never shown hostility toward the other children or attempted to sabotage their defensive preparations. The infection enhanced physical capabilities without necessarily destroying moral reasoning or emotional connections. I made the decision to formalize the alliance, but with strict protocols to protect both infected and uninfected people during the remaining hours before the biological weapon degraded. Mixed teams would include both infected and uninfected members, with constant radio communication and predetermined extraction procedures if anyone showed signs of losing control. Medical personnel would monitor all participants for changes in behavior or physical condition. The first joint operation began immediately, targeting Jake Morrison himself at the water treatment plant. Officer Park's intelligence indicated that Jake had escaped during the confusion of our earlier capture operation and had regrouped with reinforcements at a backup facility. He was preparing to release a more concentrated version of the biological weapon into the regional water distribution system, one that would have permanent effects rather than the 72-hour limitation of the original formulation. Frank and the survivors at the treatment plant confirmed that Jake had returned with a larger force and was attempting to access the chemical storage areas where the biological weapon precursors were stored. They were under siege and running low on ammunition. Without immediate assistance, Jake would regain control of the facility and have the resources to contaminate water systems across multiple states. The joint assault team included 6 enhanced infected individuals led by Officer Park and 8 survivors including myself, Sophia, and Mrs. Rodriguez. The infected team members would handle direct combat operations while the survivors provided tactical support, medical assistance, and communication coordination. It was an unprecedented cooperation between groups that had been mortal enemies just hours earlier. The approach to the water treatment plant revealed the full scope of Jake's operation. He had brought in at least 30 people armed with military-grade equipment, including several vehicles that appeared to be modified for chemical warfare operations. This was not just a revenge conspiracy anymore. It was a sophisticated terrorist organization with resources and capabilities that suggested foreign backing or collaboration with other extremist groups. But Jake had made a critical error in his defensive preparations. He had positioned his forces to repel attacks by uninfected survivors using conventional tactics. He had not anticipated facing enhanced infected individuals who could ignore suppression fire, climb over obstacles that would stop normal humans, and coordinate attacks with superhuman physical capabilities. The enhanced infected team infiltrated the facility perimeter, while the survivor team established overwatch positions and communication relays. Officer Park and his squad moved through the chemical storage areas like ghosts, eliminating sentries and disabling security systems without triggering alarms. Their enhanced hearing and reflexes allowed them to detect threats and opportunities that would have been invisible to uninfected assault teams. The main assault began at 10 o'clock in the morning, with simultaneous attacks on 3 different entry points. Jake's forces found themselves fighting enemies who could absorb significant damage without losing combat effectiveness, who could see and hear better than normal humans, and who fought with coordinated precision that exceeded their own training and experience. But the infected team members were also showing signs of strain as the biological weapon approached its degradation deadline. Their enhanced capabilities were fluctuating unpredictably, with periods of superhuman performance alternating with moments of confusion and disorientation. Officer Park was struggling to maintain command coherence as his squad members experienced different transition rates and symptoms. I realized that we were racing against time in more ways than one. The biological weapon would start degrading within the next few hours, but the transition process would leave the infected people vulnerable and potentially incapacitated, just when we needed their capabilities most. If we could not neutralize Jake's operation before the infected team members began their return to normal, we might lose our only advantage against a numerically superior enemy force. The breakthrough came when Sophia identified Jake's location in the main control room of the treatment facility. She had been monitoring radio communications and detected his voice directing defensive operations from that position. More importantly, she realized that Jake was operating the chemical mixing equipment personally, which meant he was the single point of failure for the entire biological weapon production process. Officer Park's squad fought their way to the control room while the survivor team created diversions and eliminated escape routes. The battle was intense and chaotic, with enhanced infected individuals absorbing wounds that would have been fatal to normal humans, while Jake's people used increasingly desperate tactics to prevent the facility from being overrun. Jake Morrison made his final stand in the chemical storage area, threatening to release concentrated biological weapon into the air unless we agreed to his terms. He claimed to have dead man switches that would trigger multiple dispersal devices if he was killed or incapacitated. The entire facility would become a toxic zone that would contaminate the regional water supply for decades. But Jake had underestimated the enhanced infected people's resistance to his biological weapon. Officer Park was able to enter the contaminated area without protection and disable the dispersal devices, while Jake was focused on negotiating with me. The enhanced physical capabilities that made infected people dangerous also made them immune to threats that would paralyze normal humans. Jake's capture ended the immediate crisis, but it also revealed the true scope of the conspiracy we were facing. Documents recovered from the facility showed that similar operations were planned or already underway in dozens of communities across multiple states. Jake Morrison was just one cell leader in a network that included hundreds of former municipal employees with access to critical infrastructure throughout the northeastern United States. The biological weapon itself was more sophisticated than we had realized. Jake's people had developed multiple variants with different effects and timelines. Some were designed to create temporary enhanced capabilities like we had observed. Others would cause permanent psychological changes that would turn victims into long-term sleeper agents. The most dangerous variant would cause rapid physical mutations that would make infected people permanently dependent on continued doses of the biological agent. Officer Park and his enhanced infected team were beginning their transition back to normal by noon, experiencing fatigue, disorientation, and memory gaps as the biological weapon degraded in their systems. But they had retained enough of their enhanced capabilities to help us secure the chemical storage areas and prevent any accidental releases during the cleanup process. The medical implications of their transition were concerning. Mrs. Rodriguez found that the infected team members were showing signs of severe dehydration, nutritional depletion, and cellular damage from the enhanced metabolic processes they had experienced. They would need immediate medical attention and potentially weeks of recovery time to fully return to their baseline health status. But they had also gained something unprecedented: direct experience with the biological weapon's effects and detailed knowledge of how the conspiracy operated. Officer Park and his team could provide intelligence about Jake's network that would be invaluable for preventing future attacks. More importantly, they could serve as liaisons between survivor communities and other infected people who were still transitioning back to normal. The afternoon brought reports from across the region, confirming that the 72-hour timeline was accurate. Infected people in other communities were beginning their transitions back to normal, though the process was not uniform, and some individuals were experiencing complications. Medical facilities that had survived the initial attacks were overwhelmed with former infected people who needed treatment for injuries sustained during their enhanced state. Sophia organized a comprehensive medical response, using the mining camp as a regional treatment center. The facility had the space, security, and supplies needed to handle large numbers of patients who were transitioning from infected to normal status. More importantly, it was isolated enough to provide quarantine capabilities if some individuals experienced complications or delayed transitions. The children who had been evacuated from the elementary school were proving to be remarkably resilient and adaptable. Marcus Chen had completed his transition successfully and was helping other former infected people understand what they had experienced. His ability to communicate between the survivor and former infected populations was becoming a model for community healing and integration. By evening, We had established communication with survivor groups across 6 counties and were coordinating a regional response to the remaining cells in Jake's network. Federal authorities were finally beginning to respond to the crisis, but local communities were taking the lead in hunting down conspiracy members and securing critical infrastructure before additional attacks could be launched. The water treatment plant had been secured and was beginning the process of flushing contaminated supplies from the regional distribution system. It would take weeks to fully restore safe water service, but emergency supplies and alternative sources were being organized to meet immediate needs. More importantly, we had prevented Jake's people from introducing the more dangerous variants of the biological weapon into the system. 72 hours after the outbreak began, Riverside Falls was no longer under siege. We had 200 survivors gathered at the mining camp, with more arriving every hour as word spread that the crisis was ending. Former infected people were integrating successfully with survivor groups, bringing enhanced knowledge and capabilities that would be valuable for long-term recovery efforts. But the deeper challenges were just beginning. We had to rebuild our community's infrastructure, heal the psychological trauma of the past 3 days, and prepare for the possibility that other extremist groups might attempt similar attacks in the future. The conspiracy had exposed vulnerabilities in our municipal systems that would require fundamental changes in how we approached security and emergency preparedness. My role as mayor had evolved into something entirely different during the crisis. I was no longer just managing municipal services and resolving neighbor disputes. I was leading a community that had been transformed by violence and had to find new ways to work together across the divisions that the outbreak had created. Maria was alive and well, having led her own survivor group from a different part of town to safety at the mining camp. Our reunion was brief but emotional, acknowledging the changes we had both experienced during our separation, while focusing on the work that still needed to be done. Sophia had proven herself as a leader during the crisis and would play a major role in the community's recovery efforts. The final challenge was addressing the network of former municipal employees who had created this crisis. Jake Morrison was in custody, but his conspirators in other communities were still active and potentially more dangerous now that their initial attacks had been thwarted. Federal authorities were beginning to understand the scope of the threat, but local communities would have to remain vigilant and prepared for additional attacks. We had survived the first 72 hours of what would probably be a much longer conflict, but we had also proven that communities could adapt, overcome, and grow stronger when faced with existential threats. The people of Riverside Falls had shown courage, intelligence, and compassion under impossible circumstances. We had protected our children, cared for our neighbors, and refused to let extremists destroy the bonds that held our community together. The biological weapon was designed to turn us against each other, but it had ultimately brought us closer together. We had learned to trust people we had never met, work with people who had been our enemies, and find strength in cooperation rather than conflict. Those lessons would serve us well in the challenges ahead. Rebuilding Riverside Falls would take months or years, but we had the foundation we needed. A community that had been tested by the worst kind of crisis and had emerged with its values intact. We knew who we were, what we stood for, and what we were willing to sacrifice to protect each other. That knowledge would be our greatest asset in whatever came next.